In the summer of 1934, Hitler had been chancellor about a year and a half, but there was still quite a bit of opposition to Hitler within the borders of Germany. Not everyone was enthralled with his methods of governing. There were some people who were thinking, well, maybe this isn't the guy for the job. The Night of the Long Knives was probably the most significant single episode in Hitler's rise to power.
The 30th of June, 1934. The date German freedoms and the rule of civilized law died at the hands of Adolf Hitler. In the hours that became known as the Night of the Long Knives, he murdered his way to dictatorship. A string of pitiless assassins worked for 48 hours to purge all who might contest him for absolute power or threaten to reveal an unsavory past. At that terrible moment, Adolf Hitler went from just another powermonger in a chaotic political machine to a brutal dictator.
In this two-day span, he eliminated all meaningful opposition within the German borders. It was a precursor, you might say, of what was to follow on a much larger and frightening scale. It was a prelude to the Holocaust.
Germans, safe in their beds on the night of the 30th of June 1934, were not aware that a great disaster was unfolding outside. SS and Gestapo men sped to well-mapped destinations with lists of the doomed in their hands. They pounded on doors and led away bewildered people who would not be seen alive again. In his headquarters in Munich, Adolf Hitler and his inner circle nervously ticked off arrests as word came back from a network spread across Germany. From Berlin, Stettin, Breslau, Dresden, Glewitz, and other cities, word came of the progress of the purge. By 10 o'clock in the morning, lists of those arrested were growing, and Hitler authorized the next step. He sent the code word Kolibri, the German word for hummingbird, for the final massacre to begin. The tension grew as Hitler manned the telephones with his co-conspirators Rudolf Hess, Joseph Goebbels, and Martin Bormann. His dream of consolidating absolute power hung on the success of the plan, neutralizing anyone he perceived as a potential threat.
He was really on the knife's edge at all times. The army might have chosen to assassinate him, the communists might have chosen to assassinate him, people within his own party might have chosen to assassinate him. But he had some sort of a gambler's luck.
In another headquarters in Berlin, the rest of Hitler's men were in action, with Hermann Göring, Heinrich Himmler, and Reinhard Heydrich in command. Hitler took pride in his brilliantly assembled death teams.
It took Hitler 13 years to work his way to the top. But along the way, he had help from a small group of men who all shared a common characteristic. They were absolutely pitiless. One of Hitler's early biographers, Conrad Hayden, he described this cabal as beasts of prey, and that would not be an inaccurate assessment. During the killing spree, Göring is sitting at his desk in his ministry, a clearinghouse for all the murders, with his aides in there. And they're drinking beer and eating sandwiches and laughing, and there are shouts of raucous laughter coming from the room while these reports are coming in of people being killed.
As the reality of their success grew with each assassination, Hitler and his cohorts came closer and closer to the absolute power they craved. Two years earlier, in 1932, as the new Chancellor, he was still far from the consolidation of power that put him in undisputed command of Germany. President von Hindenburg had reluctantly chosen him as the only man strong enough to produce a workable majority in the Reichstag.
He's the chancellor. The president has the major power in Germany. The chancellor is a political appointment that rotates based on whichever party seems to have the edge.
When Hitler took power, he won less than 50% of the popular vote. And he assembled a cabinet of unity, as it was called. It was a very fragile cabinet. Others in the cabinet seemed more powerful than this former gutter snipe. I would have liked to have been in some of those cabinet meetings, you know, I mean, watching von Papen and some of these old conservatives and leaders of the military like Blumberg looking at Hitler and thinking, we have to pay allegiance to this man, you know, who was a message runner in World War I and was arrested in a 1924 push against the government and looked like an idiot in the process. They think they can control him.
The crowds cheered themselves hoarse. They could not see the disaster that lay before them. Neither could the men who had helped Hitler arrive at this position, from which he would kill them. To secure absolute power, Hitler had to make sure that his own Nazi leadership didn't fall into the ambitious hands of those who might take it for themselves. Hitler kept an ever-growing list of those who could thwart him. There were recent additions, acquired during his battle for the chancellorship. Gregor Strasser was a powerful rival in the party and a socialist with views opposed to Hitler. Kurt von Schleicher was a general who tried to split the Nazi party by offering the chancellorship to Hitler's rivals. But Hitler's fears focused on a far more potent colleague. Ernst Röhm, standing with the Nazi leadership, accepting the cheers of the German people after the 1932 election of Adolf Hitler, had expectations of a hugely expanded role in an aggressively reborn Germany. He had solidly earned those expectations and was a man to be feared.
If you see a still picture of Röhm, he looks like a brutal pig of a man with scarred face and so forth. He was a brave officer. He became a captain in the German army. He won the Iron Cross and was well liked by his troops. He is much admired by Hitler. He actually brought Hitler in under his wing in the Nazi Party and succored the Nazi Party by getting army funds for it. He would siphon off funds and arms from the army directly to the Nazi Party and kept it alive.
Along the way, he was probably more than any other person responsible for Hitler's rise to power.
Among all the people of Hitler's associates at the time, Himmler, Goering, Goebbels, Strasser, none of them really had a power base. They all sort of lived through him.
But Röhm was different. He had the massive backing of the 3 million man strong SA. As Hitler surveyed the huge, brawling, personal paramilitary that had brought him to power, its unruly leader began to emerge in his mind as an enemy that must be eliminated. The vast SA, Sturmabteilung, battalions, and its volatile leader Ernst Röhm were not happy to be subservient to Adolf Hitler. Although he was now Chancellor of Germany, Hitler saw his rise to absolute power threatened by the very force that had been created to protect his rise.
he had the practice of having strong-armed soldiers come in and just beat the hell out of anybody that heckled him. And this seemed like such a good idea that they realized that they really needed an association, sort of a storm battalion to serve as a functionary to clear halls, and not only to protect Hitler from speeches, but to go in and interfere with the speeches of competing politicians. So this is almost perfect, because here you have these German soldiers, they don't have a job, they're home from the war, they go to a place where there's a lot of beer, and at the end of the evening they could beat the hell out of somebody. I mean, it really appealed.
Hermann Goering's charge to the SA on its police powers left the brutish ex-soldiers in no doubt about their authority. He said, "Those who do their duty in the service of the state, obey my orders, and ruthlessly use their guns when attacked, can rely on my protection. A bullet fired by a policeman is a bullet that belongs to me. If you say that is murder, then I am the murderer." The SA strengthened Hitler's power in the guise of restoring order.
He uses the SA, itself a disorderly organization, to crush the communists and labor unions who are demonstrating in the streets for workers' rights and striking fear in people's hearts.
After an SA brute named Edmund Heines had engineered a savage and open killing of a political opponent, his trial typified the emerging reign of sanctioned murder.
Huge crowds gathered to support the defendants at the trial. In Heines's case, he received a 15-year term, which was quickly commuted to 5 years, and he ended up serving only 18 months. When he ran for the Reichstag and was elected in 1930, he ran openly as a man who had committed a political killing, and this was seen as something positive about him.
SA intimidation reached every level of German life. Nobody was exempt from its bullying.
The jostling on the streets of the diplomats, intimidating letters sent to foreign tourists and things, and now the international community starts to protest. And the word gets out that this just isn't another government of order in Germany. This is something brand new.
It's a very revolutionary group, and it really is more than Hitler wants.
Within the SA, a Rem cult developed, like the Führer cult within the Nazi Party, where Rem was seen as the true leader, and Rem was seen as the man that best represented the interest of the SA. And Rem himself was, he was in a treasonous mood, there's no question about it. He was disgruntled himself, and he never saw himself as a subordinate to Hitler.
He got drunk, as he so often did, and he said, "I'm not going to let that little corporal ruin things for the revolution. The revolution is here to stay, and if he won't take it, we'll take it without him." Well, he had a guy working for him named Victor Lutze, and Lutze was an informer. Lutze went to Hess with the information. They gave the information to Hitler, and this was one more nail in Röhm's coffin.
He wanted to have the stormtroopers incorporated into the regular army. The SA was much larger than the regular army at that time. The stormtroops had over 3 million men, where the regular army had just a little over 100,000, according to the Treaty of Versailles. And this, of course, angered the Army High Command, who wanted nothing to do with the stormtroop leaders, knew that they would be replaced by them.
The Army saw the SA as basically an untrained or undisciplined mob without any of the proper understanding of German history and culture and true duty to the state.
The Army was about 1/40th the size of the SA. But they have enormous emotional and cultural power in the country.
Hitler found himself having to choose between an increasingly uncontrollable Rome and the army. With Rome's threat to his leadership and the venerated army retaining the support of numberless veterans who fought for it in the Great War, Hitler's choice was quick and cold.
He has the opportunity to consolidate power the way he wants. and he needs the army and the established forces within society to help him. He can't afford to have the SA's turmoil and indiscipline threaten either the army or the German economy. And so in order to seize this opportunity, he realizes he has to sacrifice the SA.
It's a dangerous thing to attempt to behead a rebellious 3 million strong army. But Hitler's vision had long ago assembled the means to neutralize Rome and his stormtroopers. In 1923, he had formed the Schutzstaffel, or SS, as a personal bodyguard. SS member number 168 was an unlikely nobody named Heinrich Himmler. He had been hired by the Strasser brothers in 1924 as a secretary and district organizer.
He flopped at everything he tried in civilian life. He even tried to run a chicken farm, and he couldn't do that.
But Hitler had seen something special in Himmler and made him Reichsführer of the SS in 1929 when he was just 28. At the time, the SS was made up of just 280 men and was subordinate to Rome's SA. Himmler began a dramatic expansion of SS numbers and roles, beginning with recruiting a sensational new talent of his own.
Reinhard Heydrich was an ex-naval officer. He was cashiered out of the Navy. He originally tried to get into the SA, and he submitted an application, and Ernst Röhm made the big mistake of sending his application over to Himmler, who was in charge of the SS. Himmler interviewed Heydrich at his chicken farm. He had absolutely no concept of right or wrong or human life.
He was exactly the character Himmler was looking for in the SS, a stone-cold killer. By 1932, he had risen meteorically to full SS colonel. In Himmler and Heydrich, Hitler had his executioners in place for his epic purge. But he needed total control of the government before he could turn them loose. With his caste and decision in place, Hitler began to assemble the plans and means for a betrayal and annihilation of friends and enemies alike. The scale and audacity of the butchery was a prelude to the destruction of Europe. On the evening of the 27th of February 1933, an arsonist's fire destroyed the Reichstag. Hitler had the missing piece needed to set the stage for his epic massacre. Whether the perpetrator was the Dutch communist arrested and beheaded for the crime, or a team of Hermann Göring's torchmen, has never been clear.
The very next day after the fire, Hitler calls on President von Hindenburg with a very carefully worded decree, which he said was necessary to thwart a communist takeover. He stampeded the president into signing this decree, which suspended civil liberties for everybody in Germany.
Over 3,000 people were arrested after the Reichstag fire. Not only communists, but opposing social democrats and pacifists. On the 22nd of March 1933, a concentration camp opened at Dachau. What later became a cog in an extermination machine for Jews was filled with dissenters of all stripes. Any charge of suspicion of activities inimical to the state could send anyone there without trial. A murder machine was building, and not even Hitler's close colleagues escaped its attention. After less than 2 months in office, Hitler had destroyed parliamentary government. There were no more free elections in Germany during his lifetime. But the SA, at the heart of his rise, was growing more and more hungry for its own power. The night of the long knives was rapidly approaching.
Disgruntled SA members are in the streets screaming abuse against Hitler. See, they figured that when the Nazis took power, they would reap the spoils, political office, sinecures, and things like that.
Hitler made Rome a member of his cabinet, sending him a mollifying letter, writing, "To assure you how very grateful I am to fate that I am able to call such men as you my friends and fellow combatants. In true friendship and grateful regards, your Adolf Hitler." Furious at what he saw as a rebuff to fully shared power, Rome scored Hitler's overtures. Hitler saw a fast-rising danger, and with his customary decisiveness, moved to end it. He convened a secret meeting with the army aboard the cruiser Deutschland on the 11th of April 1934 to smooth out his master plan.
President Hindenburg is dying. Hitler is the chancellor, which is the number 2 guy in the government, but the real power is with Hindenburg. He wants to combine those 2 offices to be in charge of both. He also wants to be in charge of the armed forces. But he can't do that without the support of the army. And he will strike a deal with the army in order to get their support.
He would take care of Rome and the SA, this is what the Night of the Long Knives was all about.
There had been strong speculation that the army also threatened Hitler with revealing what it knew about rampant homosexuality in the highest ranks of the Nazi Party, with Rome leading the debauchery. The arrogant power of the SA let them live out a lifestyle largely hidden from the German people. In the SA community, the Greek ideal of masculine homosexual supremacy and militarism was richly realized. It observed that they lived in a male world without women, a world of camps and marching, rallies and sports. And the Munich SA became notorious on account of them. Rome's amorous forays to gay bars and Turkish baths were riotous. He flaunted his homosexuality in public and insisted that his comrades do the same. Himmler stormed, "Does it not constitute a danger to the Nazi movement if it can be said that Nazi leaders are chosen for sexual reasons?" None of this was overlooked by Hitler, but he withheld his denunciation of homosexuality, perhaps wary of his own links to it, until the fast-approaching right time.
From them and the discriminated provisions.
Disturbing challenges to Hitler's advance to power appeared to goad him into action. Vice-Chancellor Franz von Papen went over his head to make an astonishingly brazen speech that threatened to destroy progress.
He came out and said we should get back to the old ways, we should restore the freedom of speech, we've got to get away from these bloody means.
The world by conquering ourselves with the help of God in a spirit of solidarity for the sake of the common weal.
And it was an astounding speech written by, not by him, but by a man on his staff. And of course, when Hitler heard about it, he was furious. Goebbels seized the newspapers and wouldn't let them be distributed, but the speech got out.
Von Papen was a personal friend and neighbor of the president, so Hitler was concerned that if it ever got to the point where the president would declare martial law, he'd lose everything he'd ever worked for.
There was even more trouble taking shape to speed events.
Hitler decided, after hearing the German ambassador in Paris, that Ernst Röhm had been contacting the French behind Hitler's back to ask if they would object to a regime change in Germany. And when he heard that, then he knew that he had to take drastic action.
So his solution was quite simple. He would invent a plot to overthrow the government and then kill everybody who was supposedly involved.
The SA had outlived its usefulness. Okay, it had cleared the streets, in a sense. generated the chaos that Hitler needed to present himself as a restorer of order. But then Hitler was forced to control that chaos, to restore that order, and the way to do that, the instrument was a coup against his own people.
Working out of Gestapo headquarters in early June 1934, Reinhard Heydrich meticulously charted Hitler's dazzling purge operation and assigned it the disarming codename Hummingbird. Sealed envelopes containing instructions were distributed to Gestapo units throughout Germany. Hitler made himself part of an elaborate strategy to allay suspicion. On the 28th of June, he attended a wedding of a local Gauleiter, and later ostentatiously visited the wealthy Krupp family.
There has already been an arrangement made that Röhm was going to go on leave because he was not well, and that the entire SA was going to take the month of July off.
There was never any evidence that a plot existed. Ernst Röhm, who was the head of the Brown Shirts, was on vacation. He was down on holiday at the Hotel Hanselbar at Bad Wiessee.
So Hitler sent to Röhm and said, I want to see the SA people on June 30th at 11 a.m. There'd been an incident in which some SA people had roughed up some foreigners, some foreign diplomats, and he wanted to ostensibly lecture them about you can't do this to foreign diplomats.
The SA commander dispatched telegrams to his top officers to rush to Bad Wiessee. He scheduled a banquet with a specially ordered vegetarian menu for Hitler. Röhm had not realized that it was he and his men who were going to be fed to their guest. The execution of the Night of the Long Knives proceeded brilliantly, with crispness and utter surprise.
This plan for arresting Ernst Röhm and his SA High Command was not thought out for months and weeks in advance, but actually was arranged in a matter of days and hours, and was pulled off with just a handful of police.
The 30th of June, 1934, 4 a.m. A Junkers 52 trimotor touched down at Oberweissenfels aerodrome outside Munich.
When they arrived in Munich, they were completely unexpected, and the airport manager had been told by Ernst Röhm to report to him personally whenever Hitler arrived, day or night, but no one realized he had arrived until he actually saw them getting off the airplane, and so Röhm was not notified.
2 cars sped Adolf Hitler and a handful of troops to the Hanselbauer Hotel in Wiessee to begin the Night of the Long Knives. Hitler, a loaded pistol in his pocket, trusted this critical part of the plan to no one but himself.
They arrived at 6 a.m. just as the stormtroop guards were changing, and most of them were asleep in the basement, and the guards at the door had gone downstairs to waken the new shift, the day shift, and so Hitler was able to enter the hotel, and then his escort arrested and locked up the guards. I got the hotel manager out of bed and looked on the guest register to find out what room that Ernst Röhm and his companions were in, and immediately went up to the second floor, pounded on the door.
They were apparently having a party that night, the SS members, and many of them were, avowedly homosexuals. There was a lot of debauchery going on.
Hitler goes in, says, "You're under arrest." Goes to the next room, finds Röhm's deputy Hein is in there in bed with his chauffeur, and is disgusted by that and orders them arrested.
Unspoken was the fact that Hitler had known from the earliest days of the widespread homosexuality at the top of the SA. When a contingent of Röhm's SA men arrived unexpectedly in enough force to destroy the entire plot, Hitler brazened his way through.
Here come some SA troops, two big loads of them in personnel carriers, armed. And Hitler walks out and says, turn around, go back, you'll be disarmed on the way back to Munich and placed under arrest. And these guys accepted.
At the Munich railway station, the SA leaders responding to telegrams from Rome were arrested by SS troops as they arrived and sent to join him in Stadelheim prison along with those taken at Bad Wiese.
And once Rome was out of the way, that's when Goebbels picked up the phone in Munich and calls Göring in Berlin and utters the code word Kolibri.
With that, the signal for an arbitrary mass butchery of unconvicted German citizens had been given. The death list had enormous range and included the Munich and Berlin SA leaders August Schneidhuber and Karl Ernst. The army lost General Ferdinand von Bredau and the priesthood Father Bernhard Stempfel. Dissident writer Walter Schott and journalist Edgar Jung were murdered. Dr. Erich Klausner paid the price for writing the Van Papen speech, and Gustav von Klar died because he had once given evidence against Hitler in the Putsch trial. Dr. Wilhelm Schmidt died in error, and the Nazis apologized. In Berlin, Heydrich was in his element on the night of the Long Knives. He relayed orders to teams of killers poised throughout the Reich, using the telephone and the Gestapo teleprinter network.
This is an operation where the SS really establishes itself as the prime tool for Hitler in the future. They're going to be the loyal political tool that he's been looking for, that the SA did not provide for him, the SS will.
One of the principal executioners used by the Nazi leadership in the Night of the Long Knives was Josef Sepp Dietrich, who was an SS commandant, who was the head of Adolf Hitler's bodyguard. Sepp Dietrich led the execution squad at Stadelheim prison that shot to death 6 of the top SA leaders during this purge of June 30th, 1934. Dietrich had them executed by a squad, announcing to them in their cells, one by one, that they had been sentenced to death, and then exclaiming, "Heil Hitler," and having them taken out and stood in front of a wall.
Rotating teams of riflemen formed firing squads whose killing continued almost non-stop over 2 days. Oddly, Rome, the main target of the Night of the Long Knives, came closest to escaping its deadly reach. In Berlin, the Night of the Long Knives was directed by Hermann Göring. Göring led the SS into SA headquarters and ran through the building, repeatedly pointing and shouting, "Arrest him! Arrest him!" All those pointed out were doomed. 150 SA leaders had their names called out 4 at a time. Those called were marched to a brick wall, their shirts torn from them, and a charcoal circle drawn around their left nipple. Those not yet called watched their own approaching fate through the window as blood, flesh, and bone splattered the wall behind the shootings. Special enemies like Kurt von Schleicher and Gregor Strasser got special treatment.
In the case of Schleicher, the 2 men with long trench coats came and knocked on the door, and the servant admitted them, and they walked into the room where Schleicher was sitting, and they said, "Are you General Schleicher?" And he said, "I am." And they shot him, just pulled out their Walther pistols and put bullets into him. Strasser's murder was perhaps particularly horrible in the fact that he was in a cell, and they just leaned in and shot through the window of the thing, and he kept dodging and dodging around a cell until finally they killed him. But I mean, it was a protracted assassination.
As the death count grew, they may also have been covering up Hitler's sexual history. Although evidence of sexual indiscretions by the Führer had been murderously suppressed, always there were whispers that he'd been a male prostitute in Vienna and Munich as a youth, that he'd been listed as such in Viennese police records, that his foppish mannerisms went suspiciously with his surrounding himself with practicing homosexual companions and co-workers. The homosexual Rome had once made him a protege. Maybe Rome had to die not only because he had too much power, but because he knew too much about Hitler's past. Adolf's history with women was equally troubled.
Back in 1931, Hitler was having an affair with his young niece, Geli Robbel, and she ended up supposedly committing suicide. Her death was under very peculiar circumstances. She was found laying on the floor of her room, dead in the morning, and she had had a violent argument with Hitler the preceding day, and he claimed that when she died that he was out of town. But this was refuted by the proprietor of a tavern, who said that Hitler and this girl had been at his place of business the preceding evening, and they had left after midnight. And during the Night of the Long Knives, this proprietor, Karl Zentner, was killed, also a wine steward and the head waiter, and these were witnesses that obviously that Hitler wanted out of the way.
On the Night of the Long Knives, many of the top SA leaders were killed, many of them arbitrarily. They were really loyal to Hitler. They were just killed because Himmler and Goering had fed Hitler with lots of false material. Heydrich in particular had fed Hitler with dossiers on people that were totally bogus.
The killing started on Saturday morning, June 30th. Hitler flies back from Munich to Berlin. And then talk about incongruity. Here on Sunday, Hitler is hosting a tea party at the Chancellery, and he's bantering with his guests under this facade of civility, while at the same time out at Lichterfeld Barracks they're still lining the victims up against the wall and executing them.
He struggled about killing Rem. There's a lot of speculation about this. Some people speculate that perhaps he might have felt a line of loyalty to his former comrade that helped him start the movement, one of the original street fighters. A guy who stood in the docket with him in 1924 when he was on trial for high treason.
He took his name off the list to be killed until he was finally persuaded the following day by Himmler and Goering that you can't kill all his subordinates and let him live. He has to go.
His old comrade had to die, but would be offered a small mercy for old time's sake.
He wants to give Rem a chance to commit suicide, to take his own life as a former soldier. This is the honorable way to go. The guards down in Munich open the cell and they put a revolver on the desk. It's understood what it's there for. And Rem said, "You expect me, to take my own life? You don't have the guts to do it yourself." Well, he's given 5 minutes, and not hearing a shot for 5 minutes, the two guards, one of whom was the future head of Dachau prison, go in, and Rem stands up, bare-chested, sticks his chest out, fists like this, and they shoot him point blank. He hits the floor, they start pumping bullets into him, and his last words, recorded for posterity, were, "Heil Hitler, my Führer, my Führer." And there's a saying in Germany, if only the Führer would have known. And I'm sure that Rem thought that this wasn't Hitler that had ordered this execution.
In this whole episode, we see a mass murderer at work. It had all the elements of first-degree homicide, premeditation, motive, intent.
All records connected to the mass murders were destroyed. Without hard documents, lists, photos, or survivors, the number of murdered has never been accurately known. Many believe it exceeded 1,000. Propaganda Minister Goebbels denied the public any media coverage, even forbidding the printing of obituaries. A brief press release stated simply that Röhm had been removed as head of the SA, with 5 of his top aides executed for what was called debauchery. The decapitated SA began to fade as a force. The German people applauded the strong new hand that had stymied communism and restored order, forgetting who had destroyed that order in the first place.
Well, after the Night of Long Knives, Hitler was really in the perfect position. He had an agreement with the army that he was going to rearm them. He was financed by the big industrialists, Tyson and Krupp and others. And so he had the SA suppressed, he had the SS building. Elections would from then on be rigged.
The 13th of July, he portrays this as, I defended the state. These people were going to overthrow the state. They were going to just get rid of President Hindenburg, get rid of me, put these other people in charge.
He warned, everyone must know for all future time that if he raises his hand to strike the state, that certain death is his lot. One promise he kept.
He gets a letter of gratitude from President Hindenburg that says how grateful he is to Hitler for taking this action.
Hindenburg, the president, conveniently dies just about a month after the Night of Long Knives. So Hitler then combines the offices of president and chancellor.
Leni Riefenstahl, the great director's monumental film, Triumph of the Will, that film is put together in September, 2 months after the Night of the Long Knives. And it's a great Nuremberg rally, hundreds of thousands of people. Hitler is seen in the film flying to the rally, descending slowly through the clouds like a god. And you just see the faces, and they're exalted. This is their leader. This is the man who rescued Germany.
All the members of the armed forces are forced to take an oath pledging allegiance not to Germany, but to Hitler. Now he was in a position to start expanding the borders of Germany, in violation of the Versailles Treaty, which was really thrown into the ash can as far as he was concerned.
At the time, the rest of the world remained oblivious to the slaughter of the Night of the Long Knives. More ominously, they did not seem to see that this cruel night handed a homicidal maniac total dominance over a mesmerized people and a growing war machine. Eventually, Hitler's death toll grew to tens of millions as he expanded across Europe, finally destroying Germany and himself with his ambition. Who would not be seen alive again. In his headquarters in Munich, Adolf Hitler and his inner circle nervously ticked off arrests as word came back from a network spread across Germany. From Berlin, Stettin, Breslau, Dresden, Glewitz, and other cities, word came of the progress of the purge. By 10 o'clock in the morning, lists of those arrested were growing, and Hitler authorized the next step. He sent the code word Kolibri, the German word for hummingbird, for the final massacre to begin. The tension grew as Hitler manned the telephones with his co-conspirators Rudolf Hess, Joseph Goebbels, and Martin Bormann. His dream of
accurate assessment. During the killing spree, Göring is sitting at his desk in his ministry, a clearinghouse for all the murders, with his aides in there. And they're drinking beer and eating sandwiches and laughing, and there are shouts of raucous laughter coming from the room while these reports are coming in of people being killed.
As the reality of their success grew with each assassination, Hitler and his cohorts came closer and closer to the absolute power they craved. Two years earlier, in 1932, as the new Chancellor, he was still far from the consolidation of power that put him in undisputed command of Germany. President von Hindenburg had reluctantly chosen him as the only man strong enough to produce a workable majority in the Reichstag.
He's the Chancellor.
In the summer of 1934, Hitler had been Chancellor about a year and a half, but there was still quite a bit of opposition to Hitler within the borders of Germany. Not everyone was enthralled with his methods of governing. There were some people who were thinking, well, maybe this isn't the guy for the job. The Night of the Long Knives was probably the most significant single episode in Hitler's rise to power.
The 30th of June, 1934. The date German freedoms and the rule of civilized law died at the hands of Adolf Hitler. In the hours that became known as the Night of the Long Knives, he murdered his way to dictatorship. A string of pitiless assassins worked for 48 hours to purge all who might contest him for absolute power or threaten to reveal an unsavory past. Gaining absolute power hung on the success of the plan, neutralizing anyone he perceived as a potential threat.
He was really on the knife's edge at all times. The army might have chosen to assassinate him, the communists might have chosen to assassinate him, people within his own party might have chosen to assassinate him. But he had some sort of a gambler's luck.
In another headquarters in Berlin, the rest of Hitler's men were in action, with Hermann Göring, Heinrich Himmler, and Reinhard Heydrich in command. Hitler took pride in his brilliantly assembled death teams.
It took Hitler 13 years to work his way to the top. But along the way, he had help from a small group of men who all shared a common characteristic. They were absolutely pitiless. One of Hitler's early biographers, Conrad Hayden, he described this cabal as beasts of prey, and that would not be an inaccurate.
At that terrible moment, Adolf Hitler went from just another powermonger in a chaotic political machine to a brutal dictator.
In this two-day span, he eliminated all meaningful opposition within the German borders. It was a precursor, you might say, of what was to follow on a much larger and frightening scale. It was a prelude to the Holocaust.
Germans, safe in their beds on the night of the 30th of June 1934, were not aware that a great disaster was unfolding outside. SS and Gestapo men sped to well-mapped destinations with lists of the doomed in their hands. They pounded on doors and led away bewildered people